Right, welcome then everybody to our welfare debate. The question being, should libertarians support a welfare state? Let me start by introducing our speakers. On my right we've got James Bartholomew, who is known to most of you because of his book, The Welfare State We're In, which has become a classic on the British welfare state and its social implications. James started his career as a banker in the city of London. Before he became a journalist and an author, he has worked for the Financial Times and the Far Eastern Economic Review, and he was also a leader writer for the Daily Mail and the Daily Telegraph. And he's currently writing a sequel to The Welfare State We're In, which I gather is more on international comparisons and the impact of welfare states on mentality. Then we've got Philippe van Parijs, who is professor at the Faculty of Economic, Social and Political Sciences of the University of Louvain. And he also holds the Hoover Chair of Economic and Social Ethics. He has a doctorate in social sciences and another one in philosophy. And he's held visiting positions at universities all over the world, including in Russia, Uruguay, Brazil, China, Congo, Italy, Canada, the US, and also in the UK. And he is one of the founders of the Basic Income European Network. And then Harry Binswanger on the far left. Far right, fair enough. As a philosopher and a columnist for Forbes Online, he's a member of the board of directors at the Ayn Rand Institute. He holds a doctorate in philosophy from Columbia University, and he has taught philosophy at Hunter College and the University of Texas. And Harry was a close friend of Ayn Rand, and he's the author of a number of publications on objectivist thought. His most recent publication being the book How We Know, Epistemology on an Objectivist Foundation. So I'm going to give each of our speakers 5 to 10 minutes for an introductory statement, and then we will hand it over to the floor. James, why don't you start?
Do I sit over here? Oh, I stay here. Okay. Okay, well, I'll stand up anyway. Okay, so the question is, should libertarians support a welfare state? But before I attempt to answer that question, I just feel it's necessary to give a bit of the run-up to this and establish, first of all, or at least assert, first of all, that the welfare state, particularly, but not only in Britain, has had very damaging results. And I mean since about 1911, and I refer to the modern welfare state. As Kristian said, this book is really all about the damage that was done, and I contend that Britain would have been better off if the welfare state, the modern welfare state as created since 1911, has done more harm than good. And just briefly running through some of the ways in which this has happened, the most obvious way is permanent mass unemployment. Permanent mass unemployment was unknown in this country until the modern welfare state was created. People obviously were disrupted, people lost their jobs. My own ancestors were in the hand nail manufacturing business, and that business was completely wiped out in the 19th century when machine-made nails were introduced. But there was never permanent mass unemployment. Since 1970s, we haven't really known a time when there hasn't been mass unemployment. It has become permanent. It has become a normal part of life. It has been introduced and established by the welfare state. Then there's healthcare. I'm just running through this at a race pace. Healthcare, the NHS created in the Attlee administration between 1945 and 1950. And since that time, the healthcare given by the NHS has declined to be one of the weakest in the world among advanced countries. An estimated 10,000 people a year die premature deaths in this country from cancer alone because of the welfare state. That's an estimate by Professor Carol Sikora comparing our rates of cancer survival with those of the average in Europe, not the best, the average. And then we have a most dramatic example, the worst case of hospital ill care, perhaps in the modern world as has ever existed in the mid-Staffordshire. If you read that mid-Staffordshire and still think the NHS is fine because it cares for everybody, you will be disabused of that idea. The stories in that report are horrific. Then let's take education. State education. When I had the honor of meeting Andreas Schleicher, who created the PISA study in the OECD, and I asked him about a statistic which is not normally publicized when the PISA reports come out. Normally you see league tables of how different countries are doing, how good they are on various complex ratings. And it's a mixture of what they do well at, what they do not so well at, and so on and so forth. I asked him, what is the figure for functional illiteracy in each country? And he went to one of the 6 thick volumes of the PISA report, and we worked out together, adding up various numbers that are not emphasized or publicized, what the rate of functional illiteracy among 15-year-olds in Britain today is. And if you don't have functional literacy, that means the ability to read a poster and properly understand it and maybe answer a question on it, then you're not going to be able to easily get a decent job. Your future is damaged. And if you're worried about inequality, this is a way of guaranteeing it. The rate of functional illiteracy in Britain, more than entirely produced by our state schools, is 18.5%. So then there's lone parenting. Britain has become the lone parenting capital of Europe. We have an extraordinarily high rate that has risen dramatically consequent on the benefits that were given to lone parents during the 70s and 80s and remain for some time afterwards and still remain to a large degree. As a result of this, the women suffer. They are more likely to be in poverty. They're more likely to be the victims of violence. The men suffer too, actually, although that's not much discussed or analysed. But the biggest sufferers, of course, are the children, who are more likely to be abused, more likely to do badly educationally, and more likely to turn to crime and ruin their lives. So it is, I would argue, the ill effects of our welfare state have been very dramatic, very damaging. No one is more convinced of that than I am. However, we then get to the question that we're meant to address, which is, should libertarians support the welfare state? And if you were a purist libertarian, if that was a creed, if that was a belief to which you would like God had instructed you to believe in, then you'd have to say, no, we don't want a welfare state. And you could argue that other means of support of welfare would exist, and I would support you. There used to be, in the 19th centuries, friendly societies which most working men were members of, and which supported them through healthcare and unemployment. There were trade unions, there were mutual societies, there were massive charities that are about at least 10 times bigger than charity is today, existed in the 19th century, because there was not a welfare state and people stepped in. It would also be private enterprise. A lot of this is history that people just don't know. They're not taught in schools, largely because the history teachers are not interested in this kind of thing. And actually, it's almost edited out. But major newspapers would have homes for the homeless. They would have, until relatively recently, the Daily Express financed a hospital helicopter. Private enterprise was involved as well. So you could say, let's go back to that. But there are 2 or 3 problems. First, even in the 19th century, there was state welfare. There was the workhouse, which is now regarded as a terrible, awful thing. But there was the workhouse. That was not nothing. That was provided by the state, usually on a local basis. In fact, entirely on a local basis. And there were municipal hospitals, which many of our hospitals, in fact, possibly depending on how you measure it, by beds or treatment or whatever, the majority of hospital care was provided by what you could call state welfare, municipal hospitals. The others were the charities. The charities were growing until the NHS was created and growing in greater importance, and people were subscribing to them and finding insurance ways of dealing with it. But there were municipal hospitals as a backup. The second problem is, if you go for the complete libertarian view of saying no welfare state, you won't win. You may be right It may be for the greater good of the greatest number of people, but you won't win. So you will appear on the Today programme, and I wish you luck with Mr. Humphreys, and he will say to you, so you're telling me you're going to take away all the money from anybody who's unemployed, anybody who's got nothing, you're going to give them nothing, you get them die on the street with no health care, no money, nothing. That's what you're proposing, is it? And you're going to have to argue that actually it will all be fine. Good luck. The third thing is, even if you succeeded in convincing the BBC and the Guardian and the Mirror and the entire political establishment of Britain that this was a good idea, which would be a political triumph, then it's not going to last 5 minutes, because sooner or later, in fact sooner, there will be a bad case where somebody has suffered, somebody is ill, somebody is not being treated, and you say, look, we ought to do something about this. We are a rich, successful country. It is outrageous that we do not look after people who are poor and in difficulty. So it won't last. And going back to Elizabethan times, because the state welfare state starts with Elizabethan times, there were times when the people got tougher, and there were times when people got easier, and each time they had to revert to a mean, because people would not accept the extreme tough system, and they didn't like the abuses when things got out of hand. We've been through a big phase of things getting out of hand, so it makes sense for us to have a less stupid welfare state. Now, I'll finish by saying with words that were a slight misquote of what somebody said to me in Sweden. Sweden went through a process where their welfare state got way out of control, and they had lots of cutbacks in the 1990s, because otherwise they were going to go bust. So they did this, and because Sweden is a very consensual place in a number of respects, and he said to me, there was a compromise between the right and left. The right agreed that there should be a welfare state. The left agreed that it should stop being stupid. And that is effectively what I think we have to do. We have to find a not stupid form of welfare state, one which allows incentives to work, leaves them alone, doesn't destroy them, allows incentives to save. Again, doesn't destroy that, especially for the poor. One of the reasons why the poor are poor and inequality has increased is because the poor have been discouraged from saving by means-tested benefits. We want a system in which people are encouraged to be independent and live decent lives, honourably, bring up families properly. We don't want to destroy the incentives that lead to these kind of things. And that way, my view, is where people who take libertarianism as a tendency, a wish, rather than a creed, should go. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Philippe, over to you. Yes, should libertarians support a welfare state? Certainly, certainly. And the form it should take is the form of a welfare state that would not be stupid and that would be just. What would it be? To put it short, that's my short answer, and I'll detail it. That would need to take the form of an unconditional basic income at the highest sustainable level. Let me spell this out first by clarifying, I'm an analytical philosopher, by clarifying the two terms of the question. What is a welfare state, and what is it to be a libertarian? Welfare state, I simply understand it, as no doubt you do too, as some sort of public authority, some government that provides, or at least funds, cash benefits and or services to some or even to all members of the society concerned. That's what I call the welfare state. And it comes in many forms, from terrible forms like workfare to much better forms like the one I'm going to defend. What is it then to be a libertarian? I define it as someone, I think consensually enough, even among libertarians, so people who call themselves libertarians. A libertarian, I define it as someone who defends, who is committed, as I am, to a conception of justice in which freedom is central. But there are several distinct sets of people who will recognize themselves in this characterization of libertarianism. while a distinct sense of people, because there are also different versions of this conception depending on how freedom is understood and how its fair distribution is defined. I define myself as a real libertarian. That is, as someone who believes that justice is a matter of real freedom, not of sheer formal freedom. That is, justice is a matter of having not only the right, but having the real possibility to do whatever one might wish to do with one's life. So in a book I published now nearly 20 years ago with Oxford University Press under the title Real Freedom for All, subtitle, What, If Anything, Can Justify Capitalism? In that book I articulate a conception of justice that is where justice is understood as the fair distribution of real freedom. It's a conception of justice which is intended to satisfy what I regard as the two minimal conditions of plausibility of any conception of justice today. Any plausible conception of justice must be liberal. Must be liberal in the sense that it must express a form of impartiality between the various conceptions of the good life that are present in our pluralistic societies. One, any plausible conception of justice must be liberal. And two, any plausible conception of justice must be egalitarian, in the sense of expressing an equal concern for the interests of all the members of society. Now, an equal concern doesn't mean that justice requires equal outcomes in whatever dimensions, equal welfare, equal happiness, equal income, equal power. No, justice must be egalitarian in some sense, but it must be an egalitarianism that is at the same time responsibility sensitive and efficiency sensitive. Responsibility sensitive means that one should go for equalizing opportunities, possibilities, real freedom, rather than outcomes, happiness, welfare, income, etc., power. One. But in addition, that's not quite the same. Sometimes it leads to the same implications, but not always. At the same time, it must also be efficiency sensitive in the sense that one shouldn't go for greater equality, even in this dimension of opportunities, not only of outcomes, at any cost. No, one should go for most common version of that efficiency sensitiveness. One should rather go for something like a maximin, sustainable maximin, the sustainable maximization of the situation in terms of real freedom of the worst off. So it's a sort of compromise, if you wish, between caring only for efficiency and caring for equality in this dimension of real freedom. So what does this conception of justice as real freedom for all, which I defend, lead to? It leads to a justification of something that can be called a welfare state, even if it's not the welfare state as we know it, to something that can be called a welfare state, and definition I gave earlier, with as its central piece, or in a way as its basic piece, is what underlies everything else, an individual, universal, and unconditional basic income at the highest sustainable level, subject to two conditions, which I won't say very much. One is the protection of self-ownership, and two, the predictability of whatever source of funding is being used, whatever form of taxation in particular is being used. The presumption is that this basic income should be given in cash so that each person can decide how to use that income as regards both their consumption and their occupational choices. It's not only a matter of how to spend money on consumption goods, but it's also something, because of its universal and unconditional nature, that enables you to choose the sort of life you want to live. So the presumption is in favor of cash, but there can be good reasons to give part of it in kind, by, in particular, access to free education or to subsidized education, which doesn't mean that the education itself should be provided by the state in the form of public schools, but that the funding should be part of the basic income that is given to each. There can also be specific reasons for deviating from cash in order to give access to free or subsidized healthcare up to some point, and to insurance for specific risks, as well as for other public goods such as clean air, public spaces, etc. But in each case, a specific argument would need to be given in terms of positive externalities, in terms of sufficient convergence of people's preferences, combined with the cheapness of a provision to all, or, third possible reason, a mild form of paternalism, where you can rely on the assumption that people in their right minds would use their cash in this particular way, or sort of devote this part of the basic grant in this particular way. So you can discuss each of these dimensions. I won't say more of that. The important thing is that the by default option is a cash basic income that differs from existing welfare benefits in three respects, and each of them is meant to deal with some of the deficiencies of the current systems, even the pathologies of the current system, which have been alluded to just a few minutes ago. And the three differences between a basic income and the existing forms of welfare are, one, that it is strictly individual, which means that there is no need to intrude into people's privacy in order to determine with whom they live, whether they live alone or with a family or with friends, whatever. You don't need to do that in order to assess whether the person would be entitled to that benefit or not, or how high that benefit would be. Two, it's universal. There is no need for a means test. It's given to the rich, as paid to the rich as well as to the poor, which avoids the standard difficulties linked to means tests in this country and elsewhere, such as stigmatization of the beneficiaries, the low rate of take-up, so that many people who are entitled to it actually don't take up the benefits, and above all, in the light also of what has just been said, it avoids the dependency trap, which in the case of conditional benefits of this sort, means test benefits, if you try to, through your efforts to get out of poverty by getting initially a low-paid job, under current circumstances, you are punished for doing that by the withdrawal of the benefit. Basic income is a floor on which you can stand and build your life, as opposed to a safety net in which you get stuck. And three, and lastly, the third condition is the third feature that differentiates this basic income from welfare as we know it, is its unconditionality. It's not restricted to the people in work or to the people willing to accept employment if offered. It's given to the students, it's given to the people who choose to look after their children, etc., as well as to the people who are involuntarily unemployed or in employment. This basic income, in my view, is the central element, not the only one, but really the key component of a welfare state that would be defensible on real libertarian grounds. It's the central component of an emancipatory of a truly libertarian welfare state.
selfish, greedy bastards. You crush the worker. You have him at your mercy. You dictate wages and subtract a little bit from your huge profits while you vacation in the Spanish Caribbean or in the real Spanish Mediterranean or the Caribbean. Spanish haven't taken over the Caribbean yet. I think they did once with the Portuguese. You are selfish, greedy bastards. Now that is what your enemies think. You must hand over your ill-gotten gains to those who are in need. If not, you should be destroyed. You are eco-criminals. You are bad. You are vicious. You should be exterminated, liquidated. We've seen that happen in recent history, right? Now, in the face of that, are you going to answer like Neville Chamberlain? Well, here, I'll cut off my hand and throw that to you. That'll be enough for you, won't it? If you compromise with the enemies of human life and say, well, we can have a little state coercion for the sake of the poor, you've surrendered the whole game. Libertarians cannot countenance any violation of individual rights by physical force. That's what every governmental intervention is. That's what every welfare practice is. That's what the Elizabethan welfare practices were. That's what a basic income would be. It's the seizure by physical force of the property peacefully acquired by some to give unearned benefits to others on the grounds that, well, they need it. Either need is a claim, a mortgage on the life of every individual, or it is not. Ayn Rand goes much farther than the proper direction set by Hayek and Friedman. She says that your life is your own and the good is to live it. Your life does not belong to the poor. Your life does not belong to the nation. You are not your brother's keeper. That's her message. In The Fountainhead, the hero says, I do not recognize anyone's right to 1 minute of my life, nor to any achievement of mine. Ayn Rand opposes the Christian morality, not just the Christian theology. She opposes the idea that justice requires that those who achieve turn it over to those who have not. The justice means sacrificing success to failure. It does not. Justice means every man gets what he deserves. And in human interchange, the standard of what you deserve is what you are voluntarily traded for with others who own what they have, just as you own what you have. So the morality, the Christian, Sermon on the Mount, you are your brother's keeper. The whole primitive, tribal, nomadic, camel-driving morality originated 2,000 years ago is the source of all government power. All government power over the individual to violate his rights, including the welfare state. If you get rid of that, if you go back to the Greek idea that the good is a relationship of things to your life, to the individual life, not to the collective, not to God, and not to your neighbor, but the good is that which is good for a man, qua man, then you cut the ground out of this social justice idea. You don't have to appease the enemies, and I can go on the BBC and answer that question, which is, the poor have no right to point a gun at the head of anyone to get what they need. Whether they need it or want it, they have to acquire it the same way as everyone else, by earning it or by being given it as a free gift. Need is not a license to kill. It is not a license to partially kill, which is to steal your earnings. Now, I just wrote this book on epistemology, the theory of knowledge, and the reason that it's relevant today, how we know it's called, is that the two central animating ideas of my opponents come from an epistemology that I opposed. The first speaker talked about libertarianism not being a creed, but a wish or a tendency. That won't do. Libertarianism is a creed. It's a set of principles. It should be anyway. The principles of capitalism are principles. They are absolute. They are not relative. They are absolute within their context. How a principle can be contextually absolute, I explain in chapter 9 of my book. Basically, you have to throw out, again, the Christian idea of what a principle is, which is a commandment from God to be mindlessly obeyed, and view principles the way we do laws of science, as inductions from experience that hold within the context from which they were induced. If you surrender the principle to your enemies, well, that's what happened in the whole 19th and 20th century. Why did the left win? Because the right gave them the high moral ground. The right said, oh, yes, we're concerned with the poor. Oh, yes, we're concerned with the public good. Oh, yes, we wouldn't dream of asserting our selfish desire to make profits. We're going to have a humane capitalism, a capitalism that does focus on the needs of the neediest. Whereas the right viewpoint is laissez-faire. Leave us alone. That's what laissez-faire means. Leave us alone. Do not violate our rights. If you want to help, it's outrageous. The idea was said, it would be said on the BBC. It's outrageous that we don't help these people. Yeah, it's outrageous that you don't help these people. If you think it is, put up your money. But the real outrage is reaching into someone else's wallet to help these people. You have no right to do that. Spend your own money to help these people. Okay, so one issue is the principle is what governs, not some sort of appeasing, buying off of your opponents by saying, I give to charity, I support the environment, I'm politically correct, I'm a good guy, I'm not that mean, selfish person you think I am. The second is real freedom. In the book, I talk about Ayn Rand's concept of an intellectual package deal. An intellectual package deal is a concept that puts together opposite things into one category on the grounds of a superficial similarity. For instance, if I made up the term cutter, C-U-T-T-E-R, a cutter is someone who cuts human flesh with a knife. Well, that includes surgeons and torturers, murderers. There's no valid reason to put those who defend human life by cutting human flesh with a knife, surgeons, and those who destroy human life into one term. Similarly, there's no valid justification putting under the heading freedom things which give you what you want at someone else's expense, and the real meaning of freedom, which is the absence of physical force. You are free when no one is pointing a gun at you. You are free when the government doesn't point a gun at you, as well as when your neighbor doesn't point a gun at you. You are free when you do not have to take orders from someone else, but can act on your own judgment, making your own decisions and acting peacefully, respecting the rights of others to do the same. To put under the concept of real freedom, the right to loot is the same as putting under Cutter, the surgeon, and Jack the Ripper. A basic income is not real freedom. It's the power of the government's gun to take away wealth from those who produced it and give it to those who haven't. It's not coming from God. It's a transfer payment. It's a transfer payment extracted by force. Freedom is the absence of force. That is, and government is force. Those are the two things to keep in mind. Thank you.